I'm extremely privileged to chair this year's G20 annual address, which will be delivered by Dr. Nayak. And today he'll be speaking on banking sector reforms in India. I just briefly wanted to take, I know Dr. Nayak's write-up is in the brochure, but I briefly wanted to highlight the versatility of his career. He's spanned a service in government. He's been the CEO of Axis Bank. He was the country head of Morgan Stanley. He was an executive trustee of UTI. And in his most recent incarnation, he's headed a very powerful recent committee that looked at governance on bank boards that was set up by Rajat when he became governor. And therefore he has, he's really, not to mention that he's also had an academic hat. He's got a PhD from Cambridge in the early 80s, and he was also an IS officer in the early parts of his career. And he spent 5 years in the finance ministry over a very critical time between 1990 and 1995, overlooking the Indian economic reforms. I briefly wanted to flag a few issues before we start today. Today's topic is going to be on banking sector reforms in India, and I think the comparison between scheduled public sector banks and private sector banks is poignant. If you look at the issue of whether public sector, to the extent to which public sector banks are capitalized, it's known that they are weakly capitalized. But what's glaring is that when you subject public sector banks to a variety of stress tests, whether you control for regulatory forbearance or whether you allow for 70% or 50% provision cover, in other words, look at more prudent measures of discipline versus less prudent measures of discipline, public sector banks don't fare well. In the most prudent of these measures, a significant number of public sector banks would not meet the regulatory mandated levels of 6.5% of Tier 1 capital. Private sector banks, on the other hand, would. So for instance, if you look at their Tier 1 capital ratios, they tend to be significantly higher. This is just a small sample of private sector banks. But on this sample, new private banks have 3.5% more tier capital than public sector banks. That's one cause of concern. There's also the issue of Basel III. And Basel III capital requirements rank up significantly in forthcoming years, with the minimum total capital plus capital conservation buffer increasing from 9% in March 2014. I think this is correct, to 11.5% in March 2019. So there's this issue of these higher Tier 1 requirements. Then, if we look at the issue of the systemic risks posed by Indian public sector banks compared to private sector banks, so NYU's VLab has done some interesting work in this respect. So as of May 2015, what they estimated was that in an event of a 40% correction in the global market over a 6-month period, which is akin to something that we saw in the Great Recession and in the Great Depression, the Indian banking sector would require $55 billion in market value of equity to maintain an 8% capital ratio. Okay. So this highlights the vulnerability of the Indian financial sector to a global turnaround. If you look at leverage ratios in PSPs, they're higher, 18.8% compared to new private sector banks, 12%. If you look at various metrics of profitability, if you compare average returns on assets, returns on equity, if you look at measures of operational efficiency, market to book ratios, they all tell the same story. So the issue then emerges is whether public sector banks are a drain on taxpayer resources, apart from being vulnerable to future shocks. There's also a fiscal implication for these, as efforts for fiscal consolidation get impeded if the government has to recapitalize public sector banks. And in case the government decides not to recapitalize banks, PSPs would have to shrink their balance sheets to maintain adequate capital, which would have negative effects on the economy. And there are other issues, such as governance issues, and there's a solution path to correct for this. So with that in mind, there's probably no better person than Dr. Nayak to speak about this. So we'll let him go for about 40 minutes. And then for the remaining 20 minutes, we'll open it up to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Chetan. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I am conscious that so much has been written and said about the reform of public sector banks in recent months that the debate, quite frankly, has become saturated. I'm also conscious that I stand between you and dinner. So what I propose to do today is to really move off the beaten track and talk a little about the ecosystem surrounding public sector banks and public sector bank managers, and the narratives which public sector bank managers now have about how this ecosystem affects their conduct and their behavior. Almost everything that seems to separate the behavior of public sector banks from the private sector banks emerges from this very differing ecosystem within which the two sets of banks work, starting with the way boards of banks conduct their deliberations, to the way management culture develops in these organizations, to the way customer handling occurs within these bank branches, to the way the branches themselves are configured, to the inefficiencies that we might see in this sector, to eventually the quality of assets that we have. It's almost as if we have two different banking segments in our banking market, each operating according to a different dynamic. Within informational economics, this would be regarded as a separating equilibrium rather than a pooling equilibrium. And the kinds of observations that I'm going to be making are more in the spirit of the behavioral theory of the firm. So the question that I'm going to pose is, do we need a behavioral theory of the public sector bank in order that when we think about assisting them and reforming this segment of the banking sector, we have a series of measures which are more likely to succeed? So the focus is really going to be on public sector banks. It's not going to be on banks more generally. And the idea is to try and develop a diagnostic for how we think about change and reform within India's public sector. Now, I got a little worried by some of the comments that Chetan made, and I realized this is probably the kind of issues which would not have too much relevance, too much resonance in a G20 meeting. And I must apologize for that, because I know that the sets of issues that the G20 looks at are altogether different to the kind of issues that I'm going to be talking about. I think issues which are top of mind in a G20, in an international debate on banking, have really arisen from the failure of a completely different set of banks on account of a different set of products and an altogether different set of countries. But if we want to understand what ails public sector banks in our country, we need to develop a diagnostic which is inward-looking, which actually searches for solutions from within our own banking system. So you will have to bear with me if you actually expected a talk which was much more allied to international concerns about what's gone wrong with banking, because that's not what I'm going to be talking about today. So all the issues which arise in the international context on banking are also relevant. Issues about how do you ring fence retail depositors, issues about counter-cyclical capital buffers, issues about how do we measure leverage, to all kinds of other issues, right? All that is relevant from a regulatory standpoint in India. But if you're looking specifically for what is it that's gone wrong with India's public sector banks, then as I said earlier, you need to think about this a little differently. So before I actually get down to talking about this, there's one statistic which I thought I should put before you. Public sector banks in India have roughly 2/3 the assets of the banking system, but they earn roughly 1/3 the profitability of the banking system. Now, a little bit of arithmetic will tell you that the return on assets, therefore, of the private sector banks is 4 times that of the public sector banks. Now, if you believe that productivity differentials are what eventually lead to changes in market share and market structure. If you believe that productivity differences are what will eventually lead to the failure of firms and the entry of new firms into a market, then this statistic, a ratio of 4:1 in terms of productivity, should be very deeply disturbing. Now, we don't know whether this is a long-term structural difference in productivity or a short-term cyclical difference in productivity, but the very fact that there are such major differences in return on assets must mean that if the public sector banks are to continue to be in business, the kind of recapitalization that is necessary to sustain these banks begins rising, and begins rising very rapidly. And at some stage, if the government wants to hang on to these banks, it's going to affect fiscal consolidation, a point that Chetan also made, right? So we just need to bear this in mind as we think about solutions for the public sector banks. Now, I said I would be talking about the ecosystem surrounding public sector banks and the narratives that public sector bankers have developed. And there are really three themes that I want to put before you. The first theme is what I would call the gray market for loans. Now, in the years earlier when India had a very dirigist economy, very control-oriented economy, gray markets were everywhere. Consumer electronics, white goods, automobile spare parts, antiques, foreign exchange, anything imported, and so on. Chor Bazaar in Mumbai was a marvelous place to visit in the 1980s compared to what it is today. It was extraordinary how supply rose to meet the aspirations of consumers who had a certain demand for products, right? And the market seemed to work beautifully in bringing into Mumbai's Chor Bazaar all kinds of products which people wanted. So when we look at those markets, the only thing that characterized those markets was a brush of criminality that affected all of these. These products were either, I don't know, tax evaded, or exchange control busted, or counterfeit, or just plain stolen, right? And all of them were part of the gray market. So when you think about a gray market for loans, these are also markets which are brushed by a streak of criminality. And let me tell you what the narrative of public sector bankers is on this. For the last 15 years or so, we've had in our country a whole industry of loan brokers who descend upon public sector banks in order to try and extract a loan for a weak or even a dubious company, right? Now, when all this began, maybe a decade and a half ago, you could even think about this as a positive force, because long years ago, Stiglitz and Weiss showed us how it was intrinsic for credit markets to be rationed, and the greater the information asymmetry between borrower and lender, the greater the degree of rationing. And therefore, small companies, SMEs, companies in newer sectors always face this information asymmetry, and therefore an intermediary like a loan broker could actually provide a very helpful interface between the companies and the banks. But as this institution developed, it was very clear that the way in which they extracted these loans was to make alliances with people in the banks, right? And these were not brushed with complete integrity. And as a consequence of it, it was possible to ensure that a certain proportion of loans, right, got extracted and constituted the gray market, as I said, for loans. Now, when a year and a half ago, the governor of the Reserve Bank suggested that I chair a committee to look at governance issues on boards of banks, one of the things that I did was to talk to a number of retired chairmen of public sector banks to try and understand from them what were boards of companies, what were boards of the banks that they chaired like. When I talk about a chairman of a bank, please understand, I mean the chairman cum CEO. It's only recently that there's been the separation, but otherwise, the chairman is also the CEO of a bank in India. So one of the things I tried to understand was what was board ecology like? How did boards actually function in public sector banks? And the kinds of narratives that I got were quite extraordinary. You will find them bizarre. One retired chairman of a large bank in the South said, Mr. Nayak, I had scoundrels sitting on my board. So I said, well, how did you run the bank in that case? So he thought a little and he said, you know, I tried to make sure that nothing strategic ever came up to the board. And if the rules demanded that they come up to the board, I would tell them that this had the blessings of the finance minister. And to use his somewhat colorful language, and that was the only way I could stop these buggers in their tracks, right? This is the kind of narrative that got relayed. So just think about it. You've got a board which is completely broken. The chairman of the board believes that other people, other directors on the board, really have very little helpful support to provide on the board. In fact, can be hostile to the main agenda of the board, right? So there were comments of that kind. Another chairman of the board said to me, and he was a chairman at a stage when I was a banker, so I knew him extremely well. And he said, you know, in one of the board committees, we had cleared this proposal. It was a somewhat difficult proposal, and we cleared it. And then 2 minutes later, I decided I needed a toilet break, and I went out, and there was this chartered accountant director from my board. And he was on his mobile phone, and he was saying, "Haan bhai, aapka kaam ho gaya hai abhi." And he said, I'd suddenly realized that I'd been set up, right? Because I thought I was actually, you know, using all my arguments in order to try and get that loan proposal through, not realizing that a loan proposal had actually been engineered by this director himself. So this concept of a chartered accountant director, right? It's enough to give a very honorable profession a somewhat bad name, because there were all kinds of narratives being told about chartered accountant directors. One former chairman of a bank said to me, you know, your committee should really look at how these chartered accountant directors get appointed. You know, it's a big scandal. They all have political allegiances. So one just listened to him. And then I sent a mail to the Reserve Bank of India saying, could you tell me in the last X number of years, who are the chartered accountant directors who've been appointed and where they reside? And I found that 75% of them were from Delhi, Noida, Gurgaon. And if you added Lucknow to the list, it became 85%, right? So clearly, you know, we have a paucity of chartered accountants elsewhere in the country, right? So I didn't know quite what to do with this item of data, and finally we didn't put it into the report, right? But it was information of this kind, this narrative. Now, you don't have to believe what these former chairmen said, right? But if they themselves believe in it, then it affects conduct and behavior. Remember, we're talking about the behavioral theory of the firm. It affects conduct and behavior, and it shows how it is that boards of these banks function, right? I personally think we should be deeply worried because it means that these banks are really imperiled. The boards do not function the way we believe they should. They certainly don't function the way boards of private sector banks function. So, at the end of this kind of narrative, you are sort of forced to come to a conclusion that some way has to be found to operationally separate the working of these banks and the appointments that are made of directors on these banks, including whole-time directors, from the government, right? And can we not think about an independent body which actually makes all these appointments, right? And in our committee, we talked about a bank boards bureau, and that's recently been announced by the government as well, but in a very different way. Because if you put the Secretary of Financial Services and the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank on the Bank Boards Bureau, it don't change anything, right? We had thought of a completely independent professional body. You might as well not create a Bank Boards Bureau of that kind and have a committee in the Finance Ministry to handle it. It really doesn't substantively make any difference. So I'm just throwing open this idea. We need to find a solution for the kind of problems that this narrative emanating from public sector bankers suggests is needed. Let me get on to a second theme. And this is a little more standard because it's the way anyone who's worked on the interface between law and economics will tell you it should work. I think conduct is very directly influenced by the structure of the law. And if you look at the law under which public sector banks operate today, right, there is something called the two Bank Nationalization Acts. And essentially they operate under the Bank Nationalization Acts. Now, you might think that the Bank Nationalization Act is fundamentally an act for taking over banks, right? So in 1969 and in 1979, when we took over banks, right, you needed an act to govern them and to facilitate it, and that's how the Bank Nationalization Acts got taken over, got promulgated. But if you look at these acts, they contain enormous powers of regulation and of governance. A combination, if you like, of the Banking Regulation Act, which today applies to private sector banks fully and is administered by the Reserve Bank of India, and the Companies Act, which is administered, if you will, by the Department of Corporate Affairs, right, and applies to all private sector companies and public sector companies as well, but not to public sector banks. Now, because of these enormous powers that are vested in the government, it's possible for the government to do whatever it wants in terms of interventions with its own banks. You want to have executive interventions, you want to issue circular instructions, you can do it. You want to have schemes, as they call it, for any purpose, you could do it. A scheme for HR, right? You homogenize HR across public sector banks. A scheme for IT, for information technology, you homogenize it. A scheme for capital structuring, you homogenize it. And eventually you end up creating two different regulators, right, for the public sector banks, the Reserve Bank of India and the Finance Ministry, right? Private sector banks have only one regulator, right? And this is the way in which you eventually, because of the structure of the law, you affect the way in which public sector banks are impacted. We need to move to what we in the report have called a one license regime. We need one law, irrespective of ownership of banks, to apply to all the banks in our country. How can we expect two different laws to create a level playing field, right? It's logically impossible for this to happen, and yet we have lived